So, I had every intention of making my next video about the live-action Cowboy Bebop TV show, but I had a revelation, which was realizing that if I did that, it would be my fourth negative video in a row, and the thought of that kind of bummed me out. Writing about media I don't enjoy is a very fun exercise and all that, but I think a change of pace would be healthy. So, I figured it would be nice to talk about one of my favorite games. I was overcome with the urge to make this essay when I heard a song from this game for the first time in years while I was at work, and it felt like I got sent back in time. Back in 2012, when I was like 13, there was no piece of media that dominated my heart and soul more than Cave Story. Cave Story is a 2004 indie game created by Daisuke Amaya, otherwise known by his screen name Pixel. Inspired by games from his childhood such as Metroid and Castlevania, Pixel took it upon himself over the course of half a decade to create something of a convergence of their design philosophies. Describing it like that is almost kind of a disservice though, because even though Cave Story was inspired by those games, it has a number of unique qualities that allowed it to rise above its inspirations, and do some trendsetting as a result. Its small and colorful cast, enjoyable gameplay, and surprisingly gripping story come together to make something truly special, both for itself and for independent games as a whole. But as much as I want to talk about what makes Cave Story rule so much, I feel that doing a straightforward review would narrow the scope too much, at least for me. So today, we're going to be looking at the environment Cave Story came about in, why it works as a game, its unique legacy, and its proxy existence to various controversies. Indie projects in video games have a history almost as long as each other. I mentioned that Cave Story is an indie game, but what makes an indie game itself? Well, isn't that just the question? To put it very plainly, similar to how an independent film is produced without a large production company or studio, an indie game is a video game that's made without a big publisher. There are several ways an indie game can manifest, but a supremely popular idea that was around when I was getting into games was the lone dev idea. That's one person making the game, the art, and the music. A lot of indie games are like that, but that kind of ignores the history behind the scene, doesn't it? Even though a cursory glance at the Wikipedia page for indie games points to hobbyist developers making games as far back as the 1970s, you can easily find conflicting creation philosophy. For example, 1960s Space War had a small team of developers, and that game would go on to inspire other seminal early video games like Asteroids. However, there is a bit of back and forth on whether Space War can truly be classified as indie, due to the games industry not really being centralized yet, with game studios being smaller and not as abundant. One of the only game companies that existed in the early 60s was Sega, the company that would go on to create franchises like Sonic and Yakuza. And, well, in the early 60s, they weren't making games. They were into jukeboxes. And of course, there were the Nintendo Love Hotels in that decade too, but I'm getting off track. Point is, games being made by one person or a small group of people have existed alongside games as a medium for a very long time. And the meaning of an indie game can take on multiple different forms, not just one. In the 90s though, there wasn't really as accessible a space for indie devs to create something as fundamental as Space War. This decade in particular is basically synonymous in game history for a massive increase in technological fidelity. Major games in the late 80s had Mario finishing level 3, and major games in the late 90s were realizing projects like Final Fantasy VII. That game has a story tens of hours long, where the main character dealt with introspective self-doubt while facing systems they didn't understand. But they could also summon a dragon, and it was big and in 3D, and it did this. Now there were industry events where major companies showed off what was in the pipeline to audiences of people. Game development teams in those companies were growing. It wasn't quite "I'm making the two-color spaceship game" anymore. Indie games didn't go away, but this decade of massive growth was also happening while the internet either didn't exist or was in its infancy. So indie devs couldn't really reach a large audience the way a major studio could. That's not to say that games didn't have their moments. The massively popular and prolific Toho franchise, which was made by one person, debuted in the 90s. However, it debuted at the Japanese convention Comiket, and it was developed for the PC-98, which was a computer that was far more popular in Japan than anywhere else. Needless to say, it would take a couple years for Toho to get any following outside of Japan. On the game console side of things, the Net Yorose for PlayStation 1 was very important in the history of indie game development on consoles, but the toolkit was also stripped back compared to what major studios were using, so it was tough to make anything comparable because the games didn't have a lot of memory to use. I'm not gonna lie though, some of these games look pretty cute. I don't think I'm ever gonna get tired of looking at Terra Incognita. Get a heart vessel, aw. Now, let's flash forward to 2004 when Cave Story was released. It was not only extremely popular for indie game standards, it was getting compared to big studio releases, and that was sort of new. So while I'm sure there was an element of right place, right timiness to Cave Story's massive popularity, I can think of a few major factors as to its colossal success, now that we've done a quick, messy, and hyper-specific history lesson. One is its release on Microsoft Windows as a download, which is extremely convenient. To compare, the first few Toho games were released physically and, from what I understand, didn't sell astonishingly well. Maybe they did for Comiket standards, but today physical copies of the first 5 Toho games are notoriously difficult to come by, to the point where I more often see people play them through non-traditional means. Compare this to the quick Google search that gets you to where you need to be in seconds. The downloadable version of Cave Story is very easy to get started, even today, which leads me to my second factor. It's free. Yeah, even after 17 plus years and numerous ports to other gaming systems, Cave Story's downloadable version is still $0. Very advantageous to anyone with an internet connection. Finally, my third factor is how easy Cave Story is to actually get into. And I'm talking about its look. Cave Story's simple and cute graphical style is very appealing, and earned it praise in reviews of the game when it first came out. I won't definitively say that a cute style was necessarily the rule for indie games at the time though. Yume Nikki, a massively important cult horror indie game which was released roughly half a year before Cave Story, contains lots of graphic imagery and a visual style that lends itself to a lot of audience interpretation. Very different from what most of Cave Story goes for, even if the player sprite is still on the cute side. What I'm mainly trying to get across is that Cave Story looks very good for a solo project. The player sprite stands out from the detailed backgrounds, the character portraits are well done and varied, and there are a good variety of enemy designs. There's a charm that's all its own, and that rocks. There's obviously more to it than that though, so why don't we dig deeper? Downloading the game from the cavestory.com page and unzipping the file will give you the original version that was released in December of 2004. Problem is, it's all in Japanese, so you'll have to download an English translation patch. Don't worry, there's one right under the PC download link, just unzip it after you unzip the game file and you're good to go. This translation was done by the group Aeon Genesis and holds up remarkably well for a fan translation. Consider that while the indie games scene had been going for decades, there hadn't yet been a breakout hit quite like Cave Story. The glowing review that I showed on screen a minute ago briefly and bluntly touches on this fact. This was before indie devs had platforms like Steam or itch to host their projects, so the fact that there was a group that was willing and able to give this game such a good translation is pleasantly surprising. You wake up in a small cave with no memories or ways to defend yourself. After getting used to your movement and robbing a sleeping old hermit of their weapon, you end up falling out of the cave into a village populated by these adorable little guys called Mimigas. You then talk to the locals and learn about the situation. Some nefarious characters from outside the village have been kidnapping all of the residents. Another outsider named Sue has somehow been turned into a Mimiga and has been getting lukewarm to negative responses from the remaining villagers, all except for a young girl named Toroko who accepts her unconditionally. Two villainous characters named Balrog and Misery show up and kidnap Toroko, mistaking her for Sue, while talking about the plans of someone named the Doctor. It's your job to explore different locations, help every non-villainous person you can, and learn about why the outsiders came to this place, as well as what you were doing before you lost your memories, while a web of mystery slowly untangles in the background. The beginning of this game is a low-key masterclass in game design. You are allowed multiple opportunities to intuit how your character controls in several low-stakes environments, while you get a feel for the pacing and tone. Pixel has gone into depth about this being his design philosophy in a game developer's conference talk. In it, he discusses not liking tutorial levels because they railroad the experience and don't allow for a lot of engagement with the game's world. It's especially easy to understand what he means by this if you take a look at any game that has an overbearing intro stage. For example, while it's clear that this game may have taken some form of inspiration from the Mega Man series, by the late 90s into the early 2000s, that franchise was struggling with creating good tutorial levels that didn't hold the player's hand. This problem arguably reached its apotheosis in Mega Man X5, where you get stopped constantly in the tutorial level alone. It's annoying. You end up mashing through dialogue boxes, and it's not a fun time. Cave Story, letting the player explore its environments and figure things out, is implemented very well. For the most part, you're able to progress at a comfortable pace and check things out at your own discretion. While you have tasks to complete to continue the story, and the characters occasionally hint at some form of urgency, it basically never feels overwhelming. Pixel's design philosophy comes through in almost every room in the game and creates a cozy experience as a result. Even when the tone changes multiple times, you're kind of invited to just take everything in. That doesn't mean that you can just snooze through the game's challenges, however. Defeated enemies will drop things like health and ammo, but they'll also drop experience crystals that level up your weapons, which will take things like your missile launcher to a ludicrous level of effectiveness when it's maxed out. Getting hit lowers both your health and your weapon level, so while the level design gives you the ability to understand almost everything in the game world before you interact with it, the weapon design is such that you can't just charge through the stages carelessly, because there's a high probability that you'll be in bad shape for the following boss fight. So the result between these two things is a game that is both highly engaging and relaxingly pleasant. While you're going through Cave Story, you'll be getting very charmed by what you're seeing, reading, and hearing. From its length to its literal file size, Cave Story is not a very large game. A standard playthrough will take a few hours to complete, and yet it manages a very substantial experience you can't quite get anywhere else. The text, visuals, and music come together to create a very unique atmosphere, and you're unlikely to finish this game without having enjoyed at least one aspect deeply. Some of my personal favorite moments are the mysterious, almost moody ones. They usually appear in plot-significant scenes or after boss fights. It's almost as if the game is inviting you to just cool down for a moment. My personal favorite one of these moments is when you read Sue's letter near the end of the game. I always get extremely immersed and a little emotional when I read it. If you get really into it, there's a chance you'll get more out of Cave Story than games that take tens of hours to finish, which is inspiring considering Pixel did not have the resources or budget of larger game companies. To really drive that point home, let's circle back around and talk about the graphics. I briefly mentioned that I liked this game's varied enemy designs, but what you might not know is that they were all based on a bar of soap design that Pixel would craft the enemies out of while he was working on the beta build of the game. Not at all dissimilar to sculpture artists doing the same. If you keep an eye out, you can tell which sprites stuck pretty closely to the bar of soap. The character Balrog is actually a reference to these early Cave Story enemies. Creating a work's character through limitation is something I really love about indie games in general. Historically, low or zero budget indie games have had far less advertising money with which to showcase their visuals, and I can imagine that helped contribute to an atmosphere that championed graphics above all else. First impressions are very important, after all. But when you learn to appreciate a smaller game's creative circumstances, those restraints become a trademark. Yume Nikki was made in RPG Maker, and its mechanics were used to create something that's closer to an adventure game instead. Undertale's battle system was originally conceived in Game Maker Studio, and you can see Game Makerisms all over the whole thing, like in some of its non-frame-by-frame animations. Even Celeste's Mountain on its title screen and level select was made in Blender, which is free software. It's a little bit scrappy, a little bit DIY, maybe it doesn't always come together perfectly, but you're able to appreciate its existence all the same. I don't appreciate everything, though. I'll probably champion Cave Story as a breakthrough for indie games forever, but there are aspects about it that I just don't like, so I feel it's only fair to mention them. In no particular order, I hate this room in the Sand Zone, the third level in the game, where you have to navigate a dark building. It's just kind of annoying. It's a little too easy to die in, and it's not fun to navigate because there's no immediate element to understand about it other than it being a pitch black room. You run into walls until you find the correct pathway. Trial and error by way of literally hitting your head against a wall until you can stop. When I'm in this room, I want to be doing anything else. It's only a couple minutes long though, so at worst it's just a black spot on an otherwise pretty good level. Okay, now a bigger criticism. I don't really care for the best weapon in the game, the Spur. I know it works as narrative symmetry for when you return to the first cave and get your starting weapon upgraded, but I never liked shot charging in this game. Maybe it's because your jump is a little floaty, but I feel that as a weapon, it just doesn't complement your control or the game design as soundly as the machine gun. Now, how could I even say that when the fully powered machine gun lets you just ignore some of the platforming challenges? Well, it may allow you to do that, but everything we covered about the weapon design earlier in the video still applies. Flying with the maxed out machine gun just provides another means of engaging with the enemy placement. You still have to make sure you can maintain the strength of your weapon by not getting hit. However, the Spur does not use experience. Shot charging uses your experience bar as an indicator. This, combined with getting the best jetpack, makes recklessly charging through the remaining levels an actual viable strategy. This would make bosses more of a struggle if it weren't also for the fact that the Spur's damage is absolutely cracked through the roof. So even if you're fighting a late game boss within a couple hits of death, you can still deal with the situation comfortably. Too comfortably. The Spur may be a reward you can find on a repeated playthrough that lets you blow through the game's challenges, and I can see how you would enjoy it that way, but it becomes significantly less fun for me because I'm engaging with less of the game's design that made the whole thing work so well. I'm almost a little bored when I use this weapon. I'm optimizing my player character, sure, but I'm also optimizing the fun out of the experience. That's probably just my preference though. To me, the machine gun will always be the king. Finally, there's the process of getting the game's best ending, which is in a league of its own, to such an extent, it deserves its own segment. This part will obviously contain spoilers, so if you want to skip to the following segment, go to this timestamp. So getting the best ending is a giant pain in the ass. At the end of the second level, you meet this guy. His name is Professor Booster, and he seems fairly innocuous at first, just kind of hanging out in the background, being the smart old man. Unaware of how frustrating this guy is going to become later, you charge forward into the Sand Zone, meet a cool robot lady named Curly Brace, and help an old woman named Jenka find her dogs. At the end of the level, everything starts going to hell. The Doctor advances his plan significantly and starts to crush the dissenters. You begin to lose allies and get banished to the labyrinth by misery. After going through multiple moving platform sequences and fighting this thing, you walk forward into the next room. Oh no, you think. Professor Booster fell down a large hole. Understanding that the game design has spent the first 3 levels deliberately introducing things to interact with in order to progress, you go down the hole after the professor. He talks to you briefly, gives you a jetpack that extends your jump, and then he dies. Congratulations, you just locked yourself out of the best ending.
What the fuck?
The reason you get locked out of the best ending is as follows. A few rooms after Professor Booster kisses the pavement, you fight a giant core with Curly Brace. When you win, Misery floods the room with water and you almost drown. In a last-ditch effort, Curly gives you her item that lets you breathe underwater, sacrificing herself. You can't interact with Curly here. You have to leave her behind, and her corpse appears in the normal ending when all of the caves get destroyed. Unless you have the tow rope. The tow rope appears in the room where you fight the core, and you can collect it before the boss battle starts, but if you talk to Professor Booster after he goes extreme spelunking, it won't appear. So, in order to make sure you don't get locked out of the best ending, you have to leave Professor Booster on the ground after the game draws explicit attention to him. Now, I like to think I've been fair when criticizing media on this channel. I feel I've been pretty even-handed when I go into depth discussing things that I think are bad or short-sighted or could have been done better. Even though my track record might suggest otherwise, I don't love being negative all the time. I love this game, and I even like aspects about it that I think deserve more appreciation. So please keep in mind as I go on for like 5 minutes asserting that this, right here, is just the worst game design decision ever. We've discussed how Pixel's design philosophy makes so much of this game work. You're given ample time to get an understanding of your environment so you can traverse it with some comprehension of the cause and effect of every new thing it introduces. The fans in the grasslands create a gust that make you jump further. Time your jumps correctly. The pond in Mimika Village introduces an air counter and tells you that your character can drown. Don't stay in the water for too long. It's not groundbreaking, but it doesn't need to be. There's an acute understanding for most of the elements introduced in the game and what causes what to happen, until this moment. A first-time player has no way of knowing that talking to Professor Booster here will lock them out of the best ending, because the game has not conditioned the player to expect something like that. It's just a beginner's trap. Even if you go in knowing that you shouldn't talk to the professor here, there's no reason why talking to him should cause the tow rope to disappear. There's no cause and effect. What sense does it make to draw explicit attention to this guy getting hurt, only to ignore him and then later show the player that he lived? I guess this game took more inspiration from Mega Man than I thought. And you get a better jetpack out of it too. You know, you can lock yourself out of getting the best weapon in the game by trading your starting weapon for the machine gun. But you can still get the best ending with the machine gun. This type of design doesn't punish the player for an unassuming choice they're making. If I wanted to keep my starting weapon and beat the game with it, I could do that. If I prefer the machine gun and want to complete the game with it, that's no problem. If my sights are set on the spur, then I can go for it. If you implement something like this, then bravo! You've encouraged replayability in your game by giving the player a chance to express themselves through their attachment to their arsenal. If you lock the best ending behind a faulty decision that the player doesn't even realize they've made until it's too late, then you're encouraging replays, sure, but you've done it in a way where you've conditioned the player to only think about getting the best ending through course correction. They will want to focus on getting back to where they screwed up as fast as possible so that they can make the right choice this time. This decision sucks. No one I've ever seen discuss Cave Story likes this. It's just an extremely obtuse blockade. And I think that's unfortunate, because Pixel did a largely great job with his game design. He was mostly smart about creating a convergence between the design philosophies of many classic Nintendo titles in a way where Cave Story feels like a step forward from all of them. It's just a shame that in doing so, he also decided to bring forward that old-school 80s era esoterica that made getting a game's best ending a compromise between creating replayability and applying good design sense. But at least I made sure to get the tow rope this time. I've got Curly, mission accomplished. Except you have to navigate the water tunnels that come directly after this, and be very careful not to miss this house that you don't really get directed towards because it's off to the side. Don't miss the jump. Oh my god. Inside, you can lay Curly down on the bed and check the computer. There's a log entry that talks about treating waterlogged robots. The knowledge on how to do so is in a book on the bookshelf. You read the book, get the knowledge, flush the water out of Curly, and... Wait, do I leave her here, or do I take her with me? I know I have the underwater bubble item, but, like, what if the game punishes me for taking her back into the water? I don't think that would make sense, but if I'm supposed to take her with me again, why do I have to confirm it? Is it yes? No? Ugh. I have no clue. I'm looking this part up. You take her with you. After you leave the house, there's a quick boss battle with a big fish, which is actually pretty fun, and when you win, Curly drifts away... Wait, did I screw up again? My God! That's what's supposed to happen. You find her a level and a half later with amnesia, and you need a special mushroom to cure it. You know all of this is to open a door? This one, right here, the one that you pass like 20 seconds before the normal ending. If you don't do all of the required actions, it'll be locked, and you can't enter the true final level. And to end this segment on a high note, I actually love the true final level. It is ridiculously, cartoonishly difficult compared to everything else in the game, but it actually feels like a test of everything you've got, and it pushes your control of your character to the absolute limit. It's insane, the skull and underworld aesthetic is cool, the backstory of the final boss gets told to you as you play the level, and the song that plays in it, Running Hell, is iconic. No matter how many times I had to restart this stage, I never got tired of this song. The hidden sign that reads "Welcome to Hell" is a really cute touch too. This stage rules in my book. I just wish it wasn't such a hassle to get to. I mean, good lord. Chances are your introduction to Cave Story was accompanied with one of these two sentences. One talking about Pixel and how he made the game alone, and another on Cave Story being the first big indie game. These two sentences have given Cave Story its own context within game history as a trailblazer of sorts. I'd like to talk about this game's legacy in a bit more detail though, if for no other reason than to contextualize its specific place in time. Despite the two things everyone already knows about this game, actually getting a more solid grasp on its impact was harder than I expected. Don't misunderstand, the game was a huge success, but the original release was a free download, so there are no sales figures I can look at. There are sales figures of its ports, which have done well, but that isn't as much representative of its place in time as much as proof that the IP is still a bankable success for whatever publisher is currently releasing new versions of the game. The 2004 internet was not like the mid-2010s internet. When a game like Undertale, or that one jump scare horror series about the evil Chuck E. Cheese robots caught on, they gained massive fan communities that produced things like art, games, and music. It's not that Cave Story doesn't have those things, it's just that the amount of buzz something gains online these days is much more of a reliable litmus test for how many people are aware of the thing than it was a decade and a half ago. What I'm trying to get across is that despite its comparatively smaller fan community and general popularity, Cave Story is one of the most important games released in the 2000s, or maybe ever. It's consistently cited as having had a unique take on the Metroidvania, or maze-like genre of games. Compared to something like the Metroid games or Symphony of the Night, Cave Story's construction is far more linear, which I imagine might have been refreshing to fans of the genre. While you're running around different zones doing your tasks, the areas open up one after the other, and sometimes you're just railroaded there. It is understandable that more linear maze-like games came about because of Cave Story's success, indie or not. I mean, one of my other favorite games, Mega Man ZX Advent, is a linear maze-like game that came out 3 years after Cave Story. I don't know, you do the math. But while charting a history of this genre certainly helps give a better idea of the game's impact, I still think the point hasn't been made quite yet. The first big indie game is frequently brought up because Cave Story being a huge success did some legitimizing of the indie game space. I actually managed to contact and ask Rami Ismail about the game's impact as a dev that was in the indie games scene when it was super popular. And he said it was proof that you could just, make a game. And yeah. If there's something I hope I've made clear in this video, it's that the indie games scene has a long, proud history of just making things, even if it takes a while to complete. Whether it's slowly piecing your project together in your bedroom back in the 70s, toiling away in your apartment until your electricity is shut off in the 90s, or working in an office with your small team today, indie games have the appeal of people who are just really passionate about their craft. So that 2004 saw a game made by one person who had been working on it since the late 90s that connected with so many people in a way indie games rarely did at the time. There's something kind of moving about that. So with all that in mind, I wish I could just say, check this game out however you like, or get whatever version you can. Because there's another aspect of Cave Story's legacy I haven't touched on yet. And unfortunately, this is where things get a little complicated. And if you're a fan of Cave Story, you absolutely know where I'm going with this. So a lot of Cave Story's ports have been handled by the company Nicalis, which, for the uninformed, is rather infamous for the way it operated in the 2010s. In 2019, many problems with the company's activity came to light, thanks to reports from former employees. They largely spoke up about improper behavior that was acted upon by the company's CEO. We're talking about stuff like policing behavior at conventions, pushing employees to drink heavily on business trips, general rudeness, and a bunch of offensive language in leaked DMs. These former employees have gone on the record to say that ports of Cave Story would get preferential treatment over other projects they had taken on. Great for getting more eyes on Cave Story if you look at it narrowly and optimistically. The problem was that Nicalis' staff was too small to comfortably accommodate the number of games they were working on. This was not helped by the CEO telling their employees to shift development priorities, seemingly arbitrarily, not to mention that communication was shoddy at best. As a consequence, the indie devs that Nicalis was working with would get ghosted and waste large amounts of time. That's only a small part of it. There have been multiple other accounts of difficulty working with the company throughout the decade, from a lack of communication leading to scuffed ports to contract nightmares. The games industry has gained a reputation over the course of the last decade or so for being notoriously difficult to survive in due to poor working conditions, and I'm not really sure I can say something on that front that hasn't already been said by someone who's actually experienced in the field or has a bunch of accreditation. But be that as it may, there's just something particularly disheartening about learning all of this. It's learning that AAA game companies and an indie publisher had a workplace culture that was much more analogous to one another than the indie publisher was to the rest of the scene. It's learning that Cave Story has an associated history with a company that is reportedly extremely hard to work with, while it had previously been a game that worked to legitimize a much smaller space. It's learning that Nicalis also had a stint where they were taking down fan games of Cave Story that used its freeware build, despite them not owning that version, leading to many wondering why that was even being done in the first place. It's difficult to work out emotionally because it's so messy, but I think we can all definitely agree that it's something to lament, at least a little bit. There was an admittance of wrongdoing and a pledge to do better from the CEO when the initial former employee reports first came out, and from what I can gather, Nicalis and Pixel seem to have maintained a solid business relationship, at least from the outside looking in. And as weird as it was to learn that Nicalis was taking down fan games, I haven't seen that happen to the new ones that release. At any rate, despite Cave Story being so widely available these days, I don't feel particularly comfortable recommending any version of it besides the original PC download. That's all I'll say on this. At the end of the day, though, one of my favorite things about Cave Story looking back is how it has resonated with so many people. The art and fan games are clear examples, but it obviously goes far deeper than that. Look at any random comment section on an upload of the game's soundtrack, and you'll find accounts talking about their experiences with the game, and how certain parts really affected them. This absolutely extends to me too. Doing research for this video and gaining some context on the history of the indie games scene has made my appreciation for Cave Story grow immensely. Hell, I played through the game 3 times for this video, and every time I found something new to appreciate. I got re-immersed in the story, I loved vibing to the soundtrack. I took so much joy in going through this game's world again and again. In a current day and age where it's normal to see massive game releases build audience expectations only to crash face first into the dirt, there was something really nice about learning about this cute little game made by one really passionate developer. That passion completely paid off, too. Today, indie games are far more common than they were in 2004. I played a small handful of extremely popular titles, I gained new all-time favorites, and I still feel like I've only scratched the surface. And really, it's because I have only scratched the surface. There are obviously other games to thank for this increase in popularity, like Touhou Project and Yume Nikki, but I think it speaks to some form of accomplishment that Cave Story can still stand alongside those games, still be beloved by its fans, and be cited as an influence to indie darlings even all this time later. And that's wonderful. It makes me glad I took the time to look back, and it makes me excited to play through this game again, whenever that may be.